Hello and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. Have you ever thought about who gets believed in the world and why so many people are having their truths misconstrued, rejected, and dismissed? It's such a huge question and one that Dina Nayeri tackles in her latest book, Who Gets Believed When the Truth Isn't Enough. We live in a world where people of colour and also women are often not believed at all levels, from the small everyday happenings in our lives to the larger areas such as within healthcare, in policy, in the justice system, and with regards to asylum seeking and immigration. But why does this happen and how can we tackle this? I'm so glad to be speaking to Dina about this today and more. Dina Nayeri was born in Iran during the revolution and arrived in America when she was 10 years old after going through a process of seeking asylum and being a refugee. Dina is the author of 2 novels and a prize-winning book of creative non-fiction, The Ungrateful Refugee. A 2019 to 2020 fellow at the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination in Paris, and a winner of the 2018 UNESCO City of Literature Paul Engel Prize, Dina has won a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Grant, the O. Henry Prize, and was selected for the Best American Short Stories, among other accolades. Her work has been published in more than 20 countries and in the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, Granta, and many other publications. Dina has degrees from Princeton, Harvard, and the Iowa Writers Workshop. Hi, Dina. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about your latest book, which is called Who Gets Believed When the Truth Isn't Enough. Now, I'm really fascinated with this topic of in the world and in society, who are kind of like the gatekeepers of the truth and who we do believe and who we're supposed to believe, and like all the different things that feed into that, but also the people that are not believed. So I just want to start with talking about where, like, kind of like where you've come in to writing your book, like what your opinion is and like what your interest is on this specific topic.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is something that I've been obsessed with my entire life. I was a refugee when I was a little kid. I guess 8 when we fled from Iran, and I was 10 when we arrived into the US. And I think that time was just really formative because it was a time of, if you've spent a lot of time with asylum seekers and refugees, like storytelling is a big part of that life, not only because a lot of us come from big storytelling cultures, but also because our story is our way to salvation. It's you tell your story to an asylum officer and you are either believed or you're not. And so I think that was a moment where it clicked for me that this would be an important theme in my life, or not in that way, not in those words. I was a kid, but I realized, oh, this is important. How you tell your story is important, and also it can come out differently. Like when you're a kid, you believe, okay, well, you tell the
Mm.
truth and the adults make sure that things happen. Like you tell the truth and you tell your thing, and it happens how it's supposed to. There is no error of judgment, there's no human failing, there's no bad intentions or motivations that can derail you. And that is the thing I think I discovered as a refugee kid is that, oh no, you tell it wrong, and that's it for you, and even if you were completely sincere. And I think that started me on this whole thing of, well, how do I be the kind of person who is believed? Because in Iran, my parents were the kind of people who were easily believed. They were doctors, and they were
Mm.
Middle Eastern cultures, we care about education. We care about things like doctorates and things like that. And So my parents had respect, and suddenly in the refugee camps and things, we didn't. And my mother didn't. And then we arrived in Oklahoma, and again she didn't. And so I think I just was obsessed with, like, okay, what's the path to getting that in America?
Mm. Yeah, and that's really interesting. And I mean, you said like you kind of realized from a really young age that it's really important, or like the idea of the truth is really important in your life, especially. But did you really like feel the pressure of that if you can, because you were so young, but did you feel the pressure of like, oh my goodness, like whatever we say, like people have to believe it? Like, did you feel it even that you were like 9 or 10?
Oh God, yeah. Are you
Mm.
kidding me? That 9 or 10 is like old enough for so much. I mean, I think back to. I mean, I tried to kind of conjure my 9 or 10 year old self, and it's harder. But I can see my own 7 year old, and she is old enough to grasp that absolutely. But I think like then too, not only did my mother not shield us from the reality of what was happening, like when we escaped Iran, her life was in danger, and then when we arrived
Mm.
in Dubai, and then afterwards in Italy, her life again, our life was undetermined. There was this question of where we would end up, and I was very aware of that, and I was obsessed with it. Like, where are we going to end up? Like, this is not the last step in the road. And so all of this stuff was kind of laid bare. But also, we lived in a community of refugees, and if you live in close quarters with a bunch of people and everyone's honing their story, thinking about their embassy visit, thinking about their interviews, you hear, if that's all you hear the adults talking about, well, you realize that's
Mm.
important and that things could go either way.
Mm.
And oh God, and I think one of those memories too, one of the most visceral memories of our time in a refugee camp in Italy is, and I wrote about this in my first nonfiction book, The Ungrateful Refugee, about how, like, I remember we would all gather around the cubbies. There was these mail cubbies, and every time the mail came, everyone would gather around to see who got mail, and the reason was because we wanted to see who got their letters from the embassies. Like, we and
Mm.
every day there'd be rejections. Well, not every day, every week or so there'd be rejections, and then there'd be the acceptances, and the people and their visceral reactions. It's like no matter which it was, they would just collapse to the ground in tears.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
and it was, if kids sees the adults kind of collapsing one by one and they realize these letters are important, these gatekeepers and these decision makers
Mm.
are important, this is what decides what our life is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It just, yeah. So, reading the book, what really kind of one of the things that I thought a lot about was that there's like a difference between facts and then what becomes the truth. But then there's also this element of believability. And, even if something is a fact and even if it is true, it may not be believable, right? And that, I guess, impacts whether or not it is considered to be true. So I just wondered if you could speak to that, because to me, I find it really interesting.
You mean our believability as people, like, and what determines that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think over the course of my life, I've seen a lot of different kinds of storytelling. I was in the business world after college, and I saw people telling stories in their own way there in order to get like investments and in order to get support for what they were doing. And you see people like telling stories to get into universities, and there's so many different ways. Like, we kind of get to the next steps of our life via this interaction between storytellers and gatekeepers, and it's like this
Mm.
relationship is what propels us forward in many ways. And there are people who just like inhabit that space with entitlement and confidence of people who have always been believed, and confidence of people who have always been believed, and the like, kind of knowing that they have helpers on the other side, and so they give then this impression of not really caring that much and therefore being more authentic. And so they continue to add wins to
Mm.
wins. Whereas vulnerable people, it's the exact opposite. Like, all they have to show you is their need, and their situation is so desperate. There's not safety nets under the safety nets. They are they need you to believe this, and that need shows, and they're
Mm.
not as kind of well seasoned and honed in all the codes, and that shows. And somehow we interpret that as dishonesty and lack of credibility, instead of actually just like stakes. This decision has
Mm.
stakes for them. But that's not how we're trained to read it. We're trained to read kind of need as suspicious. And so that puts the vulnerable in a really bad place, credibility wise. And that's vulnerable across like all kinds of kind of spaces, I guess. You have the sick, you have refugees, asylum seekers and refugees, you have people looking for housing, the poor. We have people who are like wrongfully accused. I had stories in this book from the Innocence Project, people of color trying to get medical care, just all kinds of different groups of people who have a desperate need. They need you to believe them. They're vulnerable and they're used to being disbelieved. And so as a result, their nervousness makes them seem even more incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that makes a complete sense, because it's almost like there's an idea of how somebody should be delivering, like how somebody should be speaking. And if they're not appearing in a certain way, then that means that they're not telling the truth, which is just doesn't make any sense, really. But the other thing that you write about it in the book, and you talked about it and written about it a lot as well, is a lack of understanding that people have about different cultures, and then how that then leads to them not believing what they're being told. And especially this, I think, is in the case in asylum interview rooms. And again, I just wonder if you could just speak to that a little bit, because it's something that frustrates me to no end. Like, it is very, very frustrating.
Well, I mean, I think this is one thing that, like, you hear people say, oh, everybody, storytelling is universal. Everybody has told us, has been told stories as children. This is how we communicate as humans. And it's absolutely true. But the actual mode of storytelling is extremely cultural, so people don't tell stories the same way. They don't tell the same kinds of stories. And like, we are trained who is kind of the hero and the villain, who is the, believable one and not, based on the stories of our childhood. And we also like are trained in what is a good story based on the stories of our childhood. So I think one example I like to give is about Iranian storytelling. I talked to this asylum lawyer that I interviewed for my first book in Amsterdam, when I was in Amsterdam, doing the research for that book, for the ungrateful refugee. This guy, he was talking to me about how difficult it is to really kind of train refugees how to tell their stories. It's not language, it's really all about culture. And I said, well, what's the hardest part? And he said, you know who the hardest group is to kind of give these lessons to? And I said, who? And he said, the Iranians. And I said, why the Iranians? And he said, because when an Iranian tells their story to an asylum officer, they don't start at the beginning of the situation that they had in Iran, their troubles with the government or whatever. They don't start at the beginning of their lives. They start at the beginning of the universe. and so so I'm like, what? I said, I know exactly why that is. And he said, why? And I said, because when you're a kid, like, every single story starts with the beginning of the universe rhyme. It's kind of like our version of Once Upon a Time, but it's different. It's kind of more in depth, and it puts everything at the beginning of the universe. And I think that what that does is train you that your story is not at the center, that in order to be kind of humble and acknowledge all the forces in the world, you pull back, and you put your story in context. It's kind of it's a way to tell a story that is not the Western way of storytelling, with its heroes and journeys and things at the center, the heroic figure and their obstacles all at the center. We zoom out and we put everything in perspective. Another thing is, with other cultures other than the West, I guess, there, a lot of them share this feature of like kind of embedding in their storytelling this, fear, not fear, but like warning to children that not everything is in your control. Like, there are other forces at play. There are, jinns and demons and fairies and angels and things like that. And stories often take a complete left turn based on the whims of these other forces. And I think the idea is like, other forces can play a role and derail your life. Your life is not at the center of things. Whereas, say, in the Western way of storytelling, what we teach our students in Western programs is like agency. The main character needs to make their own choices, and those choices need to be the drivers for every moment of change, right? Well, that's not at all what they would teach you in Iranian storytelling school, right? And so I guess what I'm getting at here is that the way we've learned to tell stories is how we present ourselves, is how we kind of try to be believed, is how we tell stories that have stakes for us, that where we want something. And so this is why when you get like an old lady from Iran, and she comes in front of the Dutch asylum officer, she'll start at the beginning of the universe, not because she's lying or rambling or doesn't know what she wants to say, but because she wants to be humble, and that's misunderstood. She's then taken as a liar by the Dutch asylum officer, who is absolutely used to directness and is told that anything not so direct is sketchy and shifty and dishonest, right? So those kind of
Yeah.
codes are just embedded in us starting when we're young, and we can't undo them, and we don't question them because they're not visible to us, they're not audible to us, it's just a feeling.
Yeah, that's really that storytelling technique, I guess, is really fascinating, and I hadn't thought about it so much. But I guess when I think about, like, even in like Pakistani storytelling tradition, the thing that triumphs is community and kind of like your connections with other people and your family. Like, you are the least important person
Yeah,
within that. So
absolutely.
it makes complete sense.
And it's possible for a happy story, by the way, it's to have the main character die and then remain in the
Mm,
community in another form. Like it's the community that
yeah.
matters. And also the afterlife matters, and like there's all kinds of things that just like confuse your kind of young Western listener.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think that one of the issues with this whole thing is that the West have a certain idea as to how things are done,
Yeah.
like how you fall in love and how you get married and how you go through an education system, or like just how you work and what kind of jobs different kind of people do. Like, they have actually quite rigid ideas about these things,
Oh yeah,
which is funny because like they consider the ideas quite liberal, but actually, like, it's very it's very thick. So there's
yeah.
something very conservative about it. But things work differently in different parts of the world.
Mm.
You have communities where it's very common for people to be in like polyamorous relationships and multiple marriages and falling in love and doing all of these things. They look very different,
Yeah.
and yet when those things are brought into the asylum interview room,
Mm.
they're not believed because they're so starkly different from how we do things. And it's just that lack of understanding and that lack of awareness can have absolutely dire consequences.
Yeah, I absolutely hear that, because I think one of the most dangerous things about Western way of thinking is that they are so dogmatic and so puritanical and so rigid, and yet they believe themselves to be the most progressive and liberal, and I think like are so quick to judge other ways of living. I mean, like also like just I think you bring up the perfect example, the Western idea of love and marriage. Love and marriage is just absolutely one way, and people are
Mm.
shamed in their communities. They're made to think that they're like did some their life has been bad, or they did something bad if their love stories don't fit into those like silly Disneyfied kind of um ways of falling in love. And I think there's not even that much acknowledgement of this kind of notion of the American family have being so very new in history, like whereas some you know things like arranged marriages and all of that have been happening for thousands of years. The idea is that you kind of go off to university and you meet like the perfect boy of your own race, and then you like buy a little starter house and you have a baby by 28. All that stuff is just so it's so very dogmatic.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's, yeah, I mean, and I think it's really important that there is more knowledge and more understanding in places like asylum seeker interview rooms and in courts and in those kind of places, because until we have people that understand things, think everyday occurrences and happenings in people's lives are just considered to be false, which has absolutely dire consequences. And on that, I have heard you talk on this before, but I wondered if you had any examples of this,
Mm.
of where there has been, or things that you know of that have happened, where people have not been believed because of a cultural difference in a practice.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's actually an example in the book that is kind of perfect. I talked anonymously with this Home Office presenting officer who is kind of like a UK, the lawyers for the Home Office who are supposed to kind of actually their job
Mm.
is to fight the asylum claims. Their job is to fight every single one. But she was from a Middle Eastern background herself. And so there was this moment where she said, like, everybody in the office was just not believing actually a love story of this couple who had fallen in love, but they had only met like one or two times and only in cars, so they didn't believe that they were actually had such a serious relationship or such a serious love. And she had to stop and be like, okay, I thought it was kind of heroic of her, because against all of her incentive systems, she's like, look, fine, like I'll find other holes in this, but this is not a hole, like, because this is what happens, in a culture where, say, falling in love in this way is not allowed and would get you in lots of trouble. So then I think actually maybe I think that case did get through, and because she stepped in, but everybody else was going to dismiss it, because you can't be in love if you've met someone 3 times in a car. It's like, and then you sit down and think about it, and like, why can't you? Why can't you be in love? Why can't you? People fall in love, on the internet, after, say, talking like 20 times on
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
that's real love. Who are we to say what real love is?
Absolutely. And going back to the book as well, so quite early in the book, you tell us a story of KV, and I wondered, for the benefit of our listeners who have not yet picked up your book, if you could tell us about his story, because it is so shocking and really sad and really alarming. Yeah, if you could tell us about his story and kind of what you found and some of your reflections on that.
So KV. So in 2011, there was this man named, and whose alias is KV, and he lived in Sri Lanka, and he was the son of a jeweler, and he was arrested by the Sri Lankan government on suspicion of helping the Tamil Tigers, which are a resistance group, right? And they had said that, well, he'd melted down gold and jewelry for the Tamil Tigers, and so they threw him in detention. Now, around this time, all of the human rights organizations and humanitarian groups, etc., had very deeply reported and acknowledged there was a certain kind of torture that happens in Sri Lankan detention, right? So the same thing happened to KV. He was put in detention and he was tortured heavily. And the way that they do this is hot soldering irons to the back and the arms that leave very distinct looking scars, very specific scars. So because the government was doing this so much, there were waves of refugees coming out of Sri Lanka, all with the same scars on their backs, right? And they were going through kind of the same channels, the same translators, etc., and they would arrive in the UK and they would exhibit these signs of torture, right? Now, again, all of the courts and the human rights organizations had said this is very typical of the Sri Lankan government. This happens. It is real. It's true. It's like and it happens on a mass scale, on a big scale. So despite all that, though, I think that what happened is that the UK Home Office officers, the people who were hearing, the caseworkers who were hearing these stories, were getting desensitized to the same kind of scars, the pictures looking all the same, same set of medications, same particular English words, because they had, a small group of translators who were helping them. And they started to disbelieve. They started to be kind of question that this was happening so much, even though the country reports all confirmed that it was happening so much. So they came up with this kind of new reason to reject. They came up with this category called self-infliction by proxy. And this was kind of this just wild guess that they had taken, that what if these people are putting the scars on their own backs in order to get UK asylum? Think about that. Think about that. Like scarring themselves so much. I mean, if you just Google, Sri Lankan torture scars, you'll see what the backs of these people look like. It's horrific. It's absolutely horrific. The idea that you would do that to yourself for asylum is absolutely astonishing. And in fact, like it's this logical, like it logically doesn't make sense, because if the scars were real, they're horrific enough to actually get you asylum. So why would you do the thing you're supposedly escaping from? In order to get, if it was not happening, you would stay at home. Anyway, so the thing is that KV's case was one of these. He was rejected for self-infliction. He was like, what on earth is this? He took, he fought the court. He kind of appealed, and he was rejected several times. They said, the Home Office thinks that this is the reason, that this is the thing that happened, so we're going to uphold the Home Office's case. And his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it took the Supreme Court to look at this and talk to the doctors. And and there was, by the way, all along this legal path, as he was appealing his cases, there were doctors reports, psychologist reports, all kinds of reports saying a person has been never heard of to do this. However, it's well documented that the Sri Lankan government does this, and yet they just didn't listen.
Mm.
Finally, the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was like, wait a minute. So you're saying that something happens all the time, and we are attaching such a high burden of proof to it that we're going to not believe that. But then we're going to make up some random thing that we've created in our imagination, attach no burden of proof to it, and then just throw everyone into that catch all bucket. Like it's like the remainder. You can't do that. You have to attach the same burden of proof to every bucket of, belief, or every bucket, every theory. Right. And if none of them meet that burden, you go with the one that is the most likely. And the most likely thing in this case is that it happened by torture in the detention. Anyway, so he won his case in the Supreme Court, but it was just an astonishing couple of years. It was like Kafkaesque, just the way they wouldn't believe this story that had very obviously happened and happened to people all the time. Had a very clear explanation too of why they might have seen the same pictures again and again.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, just reading it, I was really horrified because I mean, his case had gotten all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I don't even know how many levels it would have gone through before it got there. And at every stage to have been declared as a lie.
Yeah. The
And
Home
so that, yeah.
Yeah, it was Home Office, and then two tribunals, and then the Supreme Court. I mean, the judges in the lower courts were just, I don't know, you imagine them just kind of shrugging, because like the logic failed at every level. And yet it was only the Supreme Court that seemed to care enough to just say, actually that, yeah, this logic does fail.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why it seems like the systems within which we live seem hell-bent on catching people out, because we hope that the asylum seeking process and people that are coming as refugees are given the support that they need because they're going through such an awful situation that they've fled from. But it feels like, and we see it time and time again, that actually the immigration officers or whoever they may be just seem focused on how can we prove that actually this person is not genuine. And we hear it so often. Like, we hear the narrative around the boats. The people often are just like, well, people they've just come to seek asylum, not understanding the severity of actually getting into a boat and putting yourself in that situation, which is ridiculously unsafe, and then you can't imagine what it is that they're fleeing from. But it just seems to be this like, no, they're just coming for asylum. And I just wondered, if you could talk a little bit about why the system seems to be built like that.
Because it's created by humans to protect their own like entitlements, and not to help people. Like the fact is that the asylum officers are behaving that way, and working with those particular goals of rejecting as many people as possible, because that's their incentive system. They're incentivized to reject as many people as possible, right? So, and that incentive system was created on purpose. If you're being evaluated for your work by a particular set of metrics, you're going to work toward those metrics. And so it kind of goes up to, well, who set up the system this way? Well, it was people who think that the goal is to keep as many people, to close the borders, to keep as many people out as possible, not to meet our humanitarian obligations and duties that we promised, we would fulfill according to the Refugee Convention that we signed. Like, none of that. I mean, if you look at the way the Refugee Convention that was signed, by the U.S. and European countries right after World War II, if you take a look at how that's been interpreted in American courts and European courts and, lots of places, you'll see actually it doesn't seem as though they're really trying to fulfill the spirit of it. It seems like everyone is just looking for loopholes, right? Like like, for example, the Refugee Convention defines a refugee as someone who has a credible fear for their life and for safety, can't return back home because of a fear for their life, based on 5 categories of they fear for their life based on their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and membership in a social group. Right now, that last one, membership in a social group, was a category that they added kind of like an etc, like, and any other reason you could
Mm.
basically get yourself in danger. Let's make it general, social group, right? The point was to make it general, to catch everything else that they couldn't predict might happen in the future. Why might other people be oppressed? Well, this time it was because they were Jewish, or a variety of other reasons. Well, next time it might be a completely different reason we can't even predict. So we're going to put in the word social group to cover that. Instead, though, all of the courts are trying to narrow that definition as much as they possibly
Mm.
can. In the US under Trump, the attorney general and stuff, they were doing stuff like, saying, well, a woman is not a social group. A battered woman is not a social group. Someone who's been targeted by a gang is not a social group. But the people who drafted the refugee convention would say that they are a social group. That's the whole purpose that category was made. But instead, what they do is they go to court and say, well, we don't have to let in battered women, because what is a battered woman as a group? That's not like being Jewish. You're not born a battered woman. Like,
Mm.
what the heck is that argument anyway? So yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, that's the reason.
Yeah, and I think just listening to you talk as well, I've just been thinking about kind of women that are going through domestic abuse.
Yeah,
Their experiences are also quite similar, but I guess because the system has been built by men that want to serve male interests, like being able to prove that you are unsafe and even that you have been harmed,
yeah,
like those things are just like ridiculous, that the onus that gets put on women, and then how difficult it is for things like restraining orders to be put in place or anything that will inconvenience a man, how
yeah.
difficult it is to get those things
Like,
through
oh,
the system.
you
It's
know,
just really shocking.
heaven forbid that you, like, they keep saying, ruin his life and his opportunities because of some accusation. They don't even think how the woman's life has been ruined in like a situation of like battered rape.
Exactly. So another kind of, I don't know, like an institute or like an area that is powerful is the media.
Yeah,
And this is something that there's I think huge issues when it comes to like truth and believability. And I struggle so much because I know that like all media platforms, whether it's Facebook, social media, or whether it's like the BBC, they have their own interests. And as a result, the narrative that they put out, often like how in support of the Tory government they are in the UK, for example,
yeah,
is always really skewed and really problematic.
yeah.
But it is something that we believe,
Hmm.
that we should believe. And there seems to be a sense of authority or like, I don't know, like legitimacy almost around it.
Yeah.
Where do you think that comes from? Because just where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think, because media used to have an authority and a legitimacy that it no longer has. Like, I think, you know, I guess it once was that there was a kind of rigor, I guess, to the things that make it to your
Mm.
newspaper or to your television or radio. There were only certain people who, and that had its own problems too. Whoever is in charge of the narrative, of course, makes the narrative that works for them. But, barring things like, the restricted press in places in the world that didn't have democracies, or places that didn't have a robust enough press to have people on both sides, generally, if you saw like reported news in your newspapers or in television, it was fact checked and it was kind of largely unbiased and trustworthy. But now we live in an age where anybody can make news, anybody can push out stories, anybody can and the thing that decides what we see is not that everyone's seeing the same thing. Everyone's not turning on their television and watching the same, like Walter Cronkite or whatever. Now it's our algorithms that determine what we see, and it's the things that we already agree with, right?
Mhm.
So I think there's, first of all, the brokenness of where we get our stories and where we get our news, the kind of lack of gates at all to the media, and the fact that you can kind of make up a story, make up a news organization, and just pump a lot of money into it, and it'll be as professional looking and visible as an actual rigorous like news organization. And half the people will believe because nobody really knows how to
Mm.
do our own sorting and our own scrutiny. We don't scrutinize with kind of in an educated way the various news sources that feed us our information. And then, of course, we don't even have the bandwidth to go and do further things like check the data or look up the experts and see like if they have an agenda or if they have the right education, or like has the data been analyzed the right way. I mean, obviously in an ideal world we would do all those things. We just trust, but we have the same trust that we had back when all the news sources were rigorous, and the world does not merit that trust now. Now we need to be very, very skeptical, but like people will just be like, oh yeah, I saw that. And so of course there's people who take advantage of that. There's everybody,
Mm.
people have stories they'd like you to believe and they push it out.
Mm. And I mean, I think for me, one of the things is that like a free and fair press is supposed to be like the grounds of a democratic and liberal society. And if you are constantly told that you are in a democratic and liberal society, even if your experiences do not echo that, but this is what you are told constantly, you are then led to believe, well, then if that is the case, then the press and the media must also be fair and free. But it's not. And I think we find it difficult to understand how to criticize these things and what to do with it, because it's also such a big part of society.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And I think what's been really interesting actually is during COVID, the media was absolutely saturated with COVID reporting, and also sort of the prominence and the importance that was given to government and government officials in talking about it. And what has come out since is all the kind of like the under the table dealings and all the lies and all the misinformation and all the secret Christmas parties. And it has, some of those have come out kind of because of whistleblowing and secret things being leaked.
Yeah.
Some of it has come out on mainstream press, but some of it hasn't. Some of it's all just been indie press. And that for me has been really interesting, because not only has that sort of begun like a distrust of the media, or like furthered it, but also furthered the distrust of politicians. But they still seem to be the most believable entity, I think, largely on whole. I mean, not by me and not by you, but I'd say like on the whole, it's still the thing that you would look to for some kind of, I don't know, like some kind of like guidance or like a basic line, even if you vigorously disagree with it.
Yeah, people like authority. People like being
Mm.
someone taking control and telling them, "Don't worry, I know. Like I have the answers. I have the best data. I have the most money." This is why people love Trump in America. Like it's like they just like to kind of relinquish control and put themselves in the hand of some kind of father figure. So yeah, and politicians are kind of happy to be that person. I think
Yeah,
our human
yeah, absolutely.
kind of pushes us to want to be cared for instead of taking responsibility for ourselves. And I think also part of it is this kind of very religious upbringing of the idea of a kind of fatherly god, or idea of like someone who will reward you and take care of you if you just do these things. It's kind of very simple notion of how life should be, no complexity. It's just kind of almost like just, I mean, it's almost just kind of masochistic. Like I'm going to give up all control to you, this other person. We crave it because life is otherwise confusing and difficult, and uncertain.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
no.
this stems from, I mean, you've just thrown me way back to like my political philosophy education, like, Thomas Hobbes, who says that if we didn't submit all of our liberty and all of our freedom to an ultimate power, we would just kill each other, which I don't think, I mean, but it's a very interesting theory, because it seems to be the thing that we gravitate towards. We gravitate towards being willing to give up part of our autonomy in order to have stability from above. Like it's the from above that's the most interesting thing, I think. And I mean, one of the things that is constantly on my mind at the moment, obviously at the time of recording, there has been a war on Gaza for over 2 weeks now, and over 5,000 people have been killed by the state of Israel, and the media is very clear on its position, the mainstream media anyway, but as is the UK government. But what I think has been the most interesting is that the media has had to, on several occasions already, apologize for misinformation. So they have misrepresented protests that were in support of Palestinian people, which they said were in support of Hamas. And they've done the same with how they've referred to various people that they've interviewed on the news channels. I just wonder what you think that may do for how much we end up believing the media, or like what you think the long-term consequences might be of all of this happening right now.
I mean, no, you're asking me now to make political predictions and things that I can't. I'm not an expert there, but I mean, it's dangerous. It's dangerous to feed people misinformation, especially when there's like such a consequential war going on, so many lives at stake, so many innocent people, powerless, vulnerable people, and then like here we are in these comfortable spaces, and sometimes we just take one or two little tidbits of news, whatever reaches us, and use that to form our opinion. And like imagine your average kind of American or English person sitting at home and not really following the news on Gaza, but really just kind of getting one or two tidbits of information, and that is the uncorrected version of this bad pieces of media, uncorrected version of something by a major press that feels like it's true. I mean, it's not as if they go and reach out to every single person who took in that first wrong information, and they correct it individually. Some people will remain, you know, misinformed, right? So
Yeah.
that will help shape a long-term view of everything, of Israel, of the Palestinian people, of the struggle there, and that's dangerous. I mean, where will that lead us? I don't know. It's really hard to
Mm-hmm.
see everything that's happening there, just like kind of innocent people becoming pawns and not even being allowed to have even the most basic kind of amenities and humanitarian aid. It's shocking. It's hard to know really what to say, because you do feel so powerless, and also
Yeah,
feel
absolutely,
like your
absolutely.
voice just means nothing. Like we talk over here, but we're not there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't you sometimes
Yeah.
feel
Um,
powerless watching?
I mean, definitely, I do feel powerless watching. I think it's very like it's just I think it's crossed all kind of like boundaries of any words that we have to describe like how awful the situation is, and like also like just how heartbreaking and how difficult it is to know that these things are happening, and also know that there's very little in the grand scheme of things that you can do. But I do believe that there's things that we can do still to support the people of Palestine that are being impacted. And I just on this, so obviously like with Palestine and with Israel, but also generally with any kind of war situation or conflict, the media, or not even media, but people take a line on what is the truth about what is happening. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on the different things that can influence, when it comes to something like that, what we believe about what is actually happening, and then what kind of gets told in history, and how things are understood. What things can influence that and impact that, and what we should really be almost like skeptical and wary of.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like some of the hardest some of the most difficult kind of to root out influences to our thinking are the things that are so deep seated that they're subconscious. They're part of our upbringing, part of our shortcuts, all of the mental shortcuts that we take to like make quick judgments. And those are not things we usually have an awareness of kind of moment to moment. But,
Mm.
some of the most kind of foundational is formative um aspects of what we believe is like stuff like our religion, our upbringing, our culture. I think a lot of people, for example, in America, have a hard time criticizing Israel because they're Christians and they believe like Israel has to be right. You know what I mean? Like their religious upbringing has made them believe that there are certain things and they're going to happen in a certain order, and prophecies and Jesus and all that stuff, and they don't really sit there and scrutinize what's happening. Like, wait a minute, like that's a baby that died, like how am I going to stick to my myths of my childhood, so there's that. There's also our kind of notion of our ideas of history and what has happened in the past, so I feel like a lot of people again are afraid of or they conflate criticizing the Israeli government with anti-Semitism, because and anti-Semitism has
Mm.
been so scary in the past, it's been so frightening, we don't want to repeat it, and so we kind of don't criticize. And I think those are all mistakes, and those all come from basic childhood shortcuts, that were embedded in us by
Mm.
our religions and the stories we've heard, the history we've studied early on in our childhood. And I think what we need to do is,
Yeah.
the um, there's this book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and he's a scholar. He's someone who kind of studies the way we think, and he talks about system one thinking and system two thinking. And in system one thinking, all we do is go straight to the shortcuts. We make quick judgments. We do them based on our heuristics, and we don't scrutinize. System two is when we scrutinize and we're like, hold on, let me look at this, And I think that what we can do is take all of the things we've decided with our system one thinking and try to make ourselves aware and take them to system two. So stop and be like, wait a minute, you know I'm gonna not think that Israel has to be right. I'm not gonna just go straight to like anti-Semitism. I'm going to look at this situation, and I'm going to see like who is presenting me with stories, where is it coming from, where is the source. I'm and then I'm going to make a decision about what's moral and good, and
Mm.
I think that that's the best we can do.
I really loved the reading about System 1 and System 2 in the book, because I hadn't come across it before. And your example in the book just made me chuckle, because everything that you said. So you gave an example of like, okay, like a bat and a ball cost $1.10,
That's Daniel
and you
Kahneman.
know that the bat is $1 more expensive than the ball.
Yeah.
How much did the ball cost? And you'd automatically be like, okay, if you're thinking about it very quickly, you'd be like, okay, well, the bat costs $1 and the ball costs 10. But actually, if you slow down, you realize that's not true, because that only means that it's a 90-cent difference. And I really loved reading about it, because it was so interesting, and it just made me think about, there are so many things that very immediately impact how we look at somebody. And as a woman who is a person of color, who is a visibly Muslim woman, I know people look at me, and based on preconceived notions they have of Muslims because of things that they've seen in the media, but also maybe their own religious or family upbringing, have an idea about who I am.
Mm.
And would judge anything that I do based on those things.
Yeah.
But if they took a moment to assess the situation
Exactly.
and maybe understand who I am or whatever it is, would draw absolutely different conclusions.
Yeah.
But the problem is that often things are done so quickly. And we have seen it in the cases where like police officers are shooting the wrong people. They end up shooting black men because immediately they're thinking, okay, there's been a crime, there's been a robbery or whatever it is, and they end up shooting an innocent black man because their thinking is that, oh, it's probably a black man that's done it, because of all these like misinformation that they've had.
Or like
And it's, I mean, it's, obviously like,
all of these Innocence Project cases of like just the wrongfully accused or wrongfully convicted, because they're just like not scrutinizing, which black man. Like it's appalling and shocking.
yeah. Absolutely. So I want to talk about the book in particular. And just quickly, I know that you actually had started, or like you'd like almost finished working on the book, and then something really tragic happened and you ended up rewriting it.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about what happened, and also when you rewrote it, what was different.
Yeah. So I guess in the story, there's a storyline about my partner's brother who died. He died in the pandemic, and he was someone that I had long, I guess, disbelieved. He took his own life. And, he was disbelieved by a lot of people. I think he was constantly seeking help, and people just didn't, you know, believe. And I think part of it was that he presented as such a privileged boy. He presented as, you know, he was a charming boy. He was so many things, so many good things, which made him not credible, I guess, as a suicide risk. But when that happened, I thought, well, you know, gosh, like, look at how wrong I was. Like, look at me, you know, I tell these stories, and I go and find these stories of vulnerable people, and I try to crack them open on the page and try to show people, like, just, you saw this so wrong, here's the right way to look at it, and here's a story that I had missed,
Mm.
and a story that I had left kind of uncracked open, so neglected. And so I couldn't finish the book without addressing that, or without including Josh in the stories. And I don't know if I should have done or not, like, looking back, but it felt like so necessary, and it felt vital, and it felt important. It
Mm.
felt like, okay, well, I want people to have a visceral example of how you can be wrong. Like, I'm sitting here saying, like, your judgments of people, your shortcuts are really, really wrong. So here's one that will shock you, or it will surprise you, where I was wrong. You know, so I think where that story
Mm.
is going, you know, is meant to be a visceral surprise, because, like, yeah, I'm the villain in that story, I guess, in some ways. And I think
Yeah.
it's important to see that, because then that'll show you that it can happen. It can happen to anyone, even someone who's, like, constantly vigilant for this, and working with vulnerable people, telling vulnerable people stories, saying, you know, people have shortcuts. There it is. It happened to me, and I think it's important to be culpable, and also that it's okay. It's okay to share that story. It's good to share that story, because our mistakes don't define us, and our mistakes are not just set in stone, you know. And so people too, who've, like, say, misjudged refugees or asylum seekers, or people from the Middle East, or whatever places I associate with, um they can just stop. Like, they can just change course. It's okay. There's not going to be some grand judgment. You know, people are so afraid of admitting their mistakes nowadays, because they're afraid, oh, I'm going to be, you know, put on trial on social media, I'm going to be canceled, I'm going to be this or whatever, that. No, actually, I think the world is forgiving and kind, and I think it's a good thing to own up to our mistakes and to change course. You know, if you've been wrong, you should talk about it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And honestly, my deepest sympathies for your loss. Because whether or not you saw it coming, whether or not you believed it, it is absolutely tragic, and it must have been very difficult for your family. So I'm very sorry for your loss. But Dina, thank you so much for your time today. It has been so fascinating and so interesting speaking to you. I hope more people pick up who gets believed and has all the same questions that I have, and has them answered as well while reading the book and listening to you today. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for wonderful questions, and for reading the book and giving me this time.
Thank you so much to Dina for such a fascinating, insightful, and super interesting conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.